the, what's this, a special meeting?
Yep, special call meeting.
Special call meeting of the Waynesboro City Council to address our motor vehicle tax assessment update. Sam, you want to lead some pledge allegiance?
I would be delighted to. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Hey, Melissa, do we have to adopt the meeting agenda for this special session, or?
You don't have to.
Okay.
Can if you'd like.
All right, so our agenda tonight is to get a motor vehicle tax update, assessment update, previous actions, and then the general budget consideration and potential next steps.
Great.
Mr. Ham.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'd first like to express my appreciation for your attendance at this special called meeting. I think there was some thought about its inclusion on our regular business meeting agenda Monday, but really I felt like this issue is substantial enough that we wanted to have adequate time to prepare and communicate well about the issue. And I think with each day that we've had to review data and collaborate about the information, I think we really have refined our thinking and our ability to set the issue up for the council. So I realize that everyone is busy, but I appreciate your attendance here tonight. And don't apologize for calling the meeting, but regret that that's where we ended up. Before I give it to Mr. McCormick, I'd like to acknowledge and welcome Ms. Von Schilling, the Commissioner of Revenue, and I would like to just let the council and the listening public know that we really enjoy a good collaborative, communicative relationship with our constitutional officers, and really it's been Sabrina's attention to or attentiveness around awareness around this issue, the relationship that she has with Mr. McCormick that has really made it possible for the staff to communicate to council and just make sure that you're not surprised by budget or bill outcomes, and that the budget that ultimately intentionally reflects the objectives that you come to. So thank you, Sabrina, and we appreciate, again, the relationship that we have with you. So, Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Hamp, and good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of council. Just to reiterate to council what Mr. Hamp spoke on, really appreciate Ms. Von Schilling bringing this to us early on. One of the things that we do during our process every year is we have a good enough relationship that when they're preparing, the commissioner and treasurer preparing to post the year-end tax book, they give me a heads up and allow me to look at it in a train environment prior to us posting it into the production environment, which is what really brought this to light towards the end of last week once she completed her work on motor vehicles. And basically, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but calling the vehicles off and trading them back and forth with Augusta County to refine it back to hopefully just vehicles that belong in the city of Waynesboro. So I may lean on her a few times during the presentation tonight, even if it's just for a head nod or collateralizer, however she prefers to look at that. But just a little bit about going back to the budget process itself, and then also a bit refining what we're talking about this evening. So during the budget process, generally your motor vehicle tax and your personal property tax are linked in rate, meaning that if you change one, the motor vehicle assessment can't be different than the personal property tax assessment. And so towards the end of the General Assembly's meeting during the previous year, during this past year, they allowed us to create a new class that was motor vehicles and assign a separate rate to it. So all we're talking about in tonight's presentation is just motor vehicles tax. We're not talking about business equipment, because the business equipment is assessed at, and again, I'll look at Sabrina on this, but it's assessed at the price that they purchased it on with a predetermined depreciation schedule. Where the motor vehicles are dependent on the J.D. Power valuation of the motor vehicles, which can come as a surprise to some folks, especially as motor vehicle prices change with inflation issues and supply chain issues. So we'll narrow in on just the motor vehicle tax assessment update. Usually what happens with the motor vehicle tax is we look at the year prior, the most recent tax year. We use that as an estimate, and then if it ends up being a little bit higher, which it usually does, it's usually 6 or 7% higher, we just allow that money to fall into fund balance. It's usually $200,000 or $300,000 that ends up falling into your fund balance, and then you use that to seed any growth in your next year's budget. Around February, Ms. Von Schilling came to us and let us know that the motor vehicle assessments were getting to look like they were going to be pretty high, and we started to work through a solution. At that point, like I discussed, there were two challenges. You had a rate issue that was tied with multiple different class values versus now where we can really just hone in on motor vehicles. So once the new legislation came out, we had a discussion with you all, and basically the direction that we got was to push forward with normally what we would receive in growth from year to year. And we kind of set an upper limiter on that. We said that came in 6-7%. What we decided was, as staff, if it comes in around 6 to 10%, it's probably not worth revisiting the issue. If it comes in above and beyond that, probably need to go back and discuss it with council. And here we are. So it is above that. So even so once we had expected about a $200,000 increase or adjustment in the tax. It ended up being closer to $700,000 at $275,000. What had happened, general supply chain issues, and general inflation impact on used cars. And again, talking with Ms. Von Schilling, it sounds like most of the impact is on 2012 and newer vehicles, that it's the older fleet that seems to be staying down in the newer fleet that's driving the increase in the assessments. And so what we were able to do was go back from 2022, which is the current year, back to 2015. We identified a few years that you might want to consider pulling out of the sample to say something notable happened those years. So in 2022, the assessment method changed from what's called clean retail to clean trade-in, and that caused about a 16% drop in value.
From 2020, you say?
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, 2020. And then in 2018 was the first year of Munis implementation, and that could have been a variety of things, but it was probably caused by category adjustments and things like that. So those 2 years are kind of your outliers. And so you end up, the average of all of the years, so the average of everything from 2022 to 2015, with outlier years included, is about 7%. If you remove the 2020 and the 2018 for assessment changes and potential software changes, the average adjustment is about 13%. So what the council had done during the budget process was adjust the rate from 325 to 275. So that effectively offsets about 18% of the 39% increase. Yes, sir.
Just so I'm wrapping my head around this the right way, that 13% is valuation of all motor vehicles.
Yes, sir. That
It's
is
not sort of an estimate of an individual's particular vehicle that has increased in value.
It is spread across all motor vehicles. And so one thing we have that illustrates that's we were able to look at a few of the different vehicles. And so one of the ones that we looked at.
Well, if that's coming up, that's fine.
No, it's actually not. It's one of the things though that I was going to just talk about through the slides. So the disparity and impact on this is pretty great. So for example, 2017 Honda Accord in 2021 was valued at $14,575, and it's $20,250. So the increase, if you stayed at the 275 on that person, would be about 23%. On a F-150, Ford F-150, the valuation in 2021 was $29,775. The assessment in 2022 would be $33,475. If you stayed at the 275, the impact on that vehicle would be about 2% because of the rate decrease. So it really does. It is disparate across all different types of vehicles. That is a gross average across everything, and the other thing that doesn't take into account is your hope is a healthy fleet is going to turn over old vehicles and pick up some new vehicles in a normal year. So then people that have current vehicles that they hold on to will get some depreciation, and what's actually pulling it up is people bought new vehicles with greater value, which you would expect to receive a higher personal property vehicle or personal property bill on. That's not what we're generally seeing here. So during the budget process during 2023, lowered the rate from 325 to 275, which effectively offset about 18% of the 39% decrease, which is just a little bit under half of the increase. The other thing that we have done in the past is we changed the assessment method in 2020 to lower the assessed values from clean retail to clean trade-in. To give some perspective on kind of what's going on around us, Augusta County chose to lower their assessment method, their ratio. They assessed at 92% of fair market value instead of 100%, so that's about an 8% delta. Stanton did the same that we did in 2020 and went from clean retail to clean trade-in to try and offset some of the increase. Some folks have tried to lower rate. I think that Winchester was one of the localities that tried to lower their rate. So everyone's kind of taking a different approach on how they want to, on how they're going to attack this, with the hope being the end result is you soften the burden some on the taxpayers.
Towards the approach of going to 92% of clean trade, is that accounted for in the legislation, or would that have been allowed prior to this Not your understanding, okay? That's what I thought, so.
It's not my understanding. The code specifically states that we must assess at fair market value.
Okay.
Fair market value is a true assessment, not a depreciation of an assessment. That's my opinion, and I think Ms. Mickelson would agree.
Yes.
Okay, understood, thank you.
And I think you can arrive at the same spot through a rate adjustment now that
Right,
we have
right.
final numbers. It was what it got difficult was trying to arrive at that when we didn't have final
actual
assessment numbers.
So in aggregate, we feel like that the impact on the budget, go ahead and flip that to the next one, please. That the impact on the budget is so substantial that it requires us to revisit. We made a commitment to you that we would do that, and even if we had not made a commitment, I think ethically a manager would have to come back and say, hey, I don't think we want to accidentally realize $700,000 of additional revenue. Similarly, I don't think we want to accidentally have the individual tax bills that produce that additional revenue. So really, our conversation tonight and moving forward is to confirm some intentionality around the rate and outcomes with the council. I think this is, I would say that the staff's job in this exercise is to make sure that we furnish adequate data and information to create, to make sure that the council is as informed as you need to be to make a decision. But the choice is, at least in my view, an exercise in calibrating, how calibrating and aligning the budget with the overall community preferences and the community's ability to bear a tax burden. And I think we can help. I can help as a city manager, but ultimately, I think that's important that the council as a body really have the most influence over that decision. So if we pull out tonight, pull back to a high level, really the choices are express comfort at 275 and say we're comfortable, we understand what will be the outcomes both individually and in aggregate, and thank you very much, we're moving on. Alternatively, you can introduce a new ordinance or introduce an ordinance that would allow you over the course of the next week and a half to consider an alternative rate. I think with respect to that, if there's consensus around 275 is not really where we want to be, or even if there's a lack of consensus, if you introduce an ordinance at 274, that would allow you to work downward. I think we've talked about this principle before. You can work down, but you can't work up. So introducing an ordinance at 274, we would advertise a public hearing. On October 12th, we'd have a public hearing, and then council would vote to adopt or not adopt that ordinance, or adopt a lower rate. Alternatively, if the council can coalesce around a a specific rate this evening and wishes to advertise that, you could do that, and then still have the ability to work down but not back up. To be clear, to kind of revisit what Mr. McCormick shared, that in a normal year where we would realize, $180,000, $200,000 of growth, typically that would fall to fund balance. And it would be used in the ensuing fiscal year to support capital investment in the budget. I think we've talked about that chart where you use fund balance to peel off and pay for small capital items or appropriate it over time to larger capital items. In this year, we feel like that there are some forces, exceptional forces on the expenditure side that we would, if the council chose a course where you were going to create significant additional revenue in the budget, we would probably recommend that you appropriate that in the current fiscal year against previously stated budget priorities, namely employee compensation. In any case, if you realize new revenue, we would do that in a way that, one, reflects or is in compliance with our adopted fiscal policy guidelines, and two, as I stated previously, would be used against previously stated priorities. I think it probably is helpful for you to know that 252, we think that the 252 realized is the 6%? Yeah, so if you want to say, you know what, we're committed to the parameters and the outcomes that we talked about in the original budget, the rate that we estimate gets you to that point is 252. Obviously, there are rates, can you move us forward one? Obviously, there are rates between 275 or 274 and 252 or 255 that, in my opinion, allow that you could extend additional relief to taxpayers and realize some new capacity in your budget to accomplish some things. And what we would do is, we've talked about the need to perhaps do something before the next budget season with respect to compensation. So we're working on an ordinance that would appropriate some growth in sales and meals in the current fiscal year to benefit compensation in the organization. And we would probably bring that recommendation in October. If council makes a decision that creates capacity in choosing a motor vehicle rate, we would simply, well, depending on the amount of new revenue, possibly include that in that ordinance. So I say that because it's easy to fall into the hazard of talking about budget questions in silos. And so really, obviously, our focus tonight is the motor vehicle rate. But it's in the context of a much larger budget and forces that I think I would feel like I wasn't doing my job if in October I bring you a recommendation about compensation and you said to me, well, why didn't we talk about that when we were talking about the tax rate? So that's the overall context of some forces that we're contending with on the expenditure side, and then our response to a really exceptional year with respect to motor vehicle values. And I think we're coming back in the middle of the year because as the dust has settled around local budgets in the area, we realized, or I realized, that we weren't able to achieve the progress that we wanted to in terms of compensation. And not only that, we're losing some ground with most of our neighboring jurisdictions because of what they were able to do. So I think we're prepared to respond to questions that you might have, but if we...
Okay. Why don't you give us some numbers, what these revenues that you've got on the board here will generate and how they benefit our compensation package and what they do for moving our employees forward?
Sure. So, yeah, go ahead.
So the way that the assessment works, it's right around 226 million, and it's basically expressed as percents once you get out to the 10th decimal place. So if you go from 275 to 265, you're talking about $200,000, 1% on 226. 226 million, does that sound about right? And then 1% on 226 million would come back to about $200,000 in revenue. So as you step down, we've basically shown $200,000 increments from 7 down to 5, down to 300,000.
So stated differently, reminder, 275 gets you about $700,000 in new revenue. 265 would get you about $500,000 in new revenue, and then 255 is 3?
Sir.
Yeah.
And the compensation, so the pair to that question was, what does that do
Right.
with compensation? The second phase of the comp study in the general fund will be between $400,000 to $500,000, depending on, it's one of those ones where you still have employees moving around and we still have to assign comps to every single person, but a budget number would be about $500,000. 1% on your raise is about $160,000. So if you wanted to say, take your raise from 3 to 4%, each additional percent would be about $160,000. The compensation study, the next phase would be about $400,000, $500,000.
Remind us how the legislation is written in terms of how long we have to have the discrepancy.
So it ends with tax years beginning in 2025 is when it sunsets. So the last year you could do this would be tax year 2024.
Then it will bump up to whatever our tax.
It would have to
rate,
re-equilibrate with the business.
tool and die tax.
And that's one of the things that that Ms. Von Schilling and I had talked about, is the further you take the rate down, unless you plan on moving the personal property tax rate with it, eventually, if the assessments don't equalize and go down, the taxpayer will realize some of this increase.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
Not a question, but just a general thought. I certainly don't feel comfortable keeping it at 275. And as a step, a good faith step, I'd feel comfortable tonight saying 265. And then get into the weeds of, what does it mean? And all of us come to our conclusion about what we're comfortable with, knowing that we wouldn't be above that, but that we could bring it down further as we sort of do those numbers and think it through. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts.
No, I think that's a good plan. That's where I was thinking the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah, I personally would like some, maybe some additional information on scenarios on age and make model scenarios of different vehicles and composition across the city. Because
You bought a new car this year, didn't you?
I also sold a car, so I'm going to get full ride on that. But I would, I guess I'm concerned about the regressive nature of this taxing tool versus a more progressive tax on real estate, right? So the valuations and the ability of a household, and we've had that conversations on the utility side. Family of 4 making $30,000 a year pays the same water bill as a family of 4 that makes $200,000 a year. And so there's this regressive nature of it. So I would be very interested to understand better, maybe just a few examples of the spectrum of impact that we might feel operating off of a theory that those that are having a tougher time probably aren't buying the Jaguar, right? And so we can kind of just a general appreciation for what the direct impact of this may be. And it sounds like newer 2015, newer vehicles, they're getting the brunt of it. But it would just be good, I think, just for the public dialogue and consciousness to be able to have that information.
So if I may, just to give you just a little thought on that, just as a comparison, when I presented back to you all in the spring, I used 4 vehicles. They were all 2017 vehicles. And so just as a comparison on that, because when Mr. McCormick and I were speaking, we were really trying to find a common denominator of, okay, this vehicle is just boom and this one is not. But that was part of the discussion was they were just so far out because just like you said, they may not be buying a Jaguar, but they very well could be buying that Camry because it's dependable, it's cost effective on.
Best car they ever had, right?
Et cetera, et cetera. And so that vehicle by itself from 21 to 22 went up 26% this year. So, but then you have your Ford F-150, which is the most popular vehicle in our locality, went down, well, it's at 2% for the rate. So it's a very big spectrum there to where we can't pinpoint A, B, and C are the vehicles that they're just going to get the brunt. And then we can go, so that's why we kind of had to come with a collaboration of a percentage. And so with that being said, in between your 265 and 255, I had ran some numbers at 260, and that Ford F-150 would depreciate from the 3 1/4 for 2021 to the 260 at 5%. It would decrease, it would be a negative. But yet your Toyota Camry would still be an increase of 16%. So just a little perspective on, there's no rhyme or reason. The Camry is not our most popular vehicle. However, it is extremely dependable and doesn't depreciate very well.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think 265 is the right starting point.
And then
Sort
we
of
can work
reflect
from
on
there.
it.
Okay.
All right, so we want a motion?
Yeah, a motion and a second, please.
Okay.
I will make a motion to change the motor vehicle tax rate to 265. Is that all I need?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Terry. All right, so we have a motion from Dr. Hossetter at a rate of 265, a second from Mr. Short. Any discussion? This motion will carry over till our first October meeting?
Correct. And we'll have a public hearing that evening.
Okay.
Perfect.
Can we act on it that night?
Yes,
Okay, great.
All right.
that's all we have.
All right. Is
All
there a
right.
motion to adjourn this meeting?
Bruce in there, okay.
Bruce isn't here, we can't.
We can't leave.
Wait, I beat him all.
I will second that motion.
Ms. Williams, Dr. Hossetter, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries 5-0.
right.
Thank you very much.